Tonight on the brink, the U.S. puts 8,500 troops on heightened alert.
Very, very, very good meeting. Total unanimity with all the European leaders.
The president rallying NATO members as Russian forces continue to amass on the border with Ukraine. Plus, shock to the system.
That's a great asset. More inflation. What a stupid.
Inflation soaring across the country. The Fed prepares to raise interest rates. All this and more tonight on Faith Nation. No U.S. troops to Ukraine. That's the word from the president tonight. Good evening in Washington, D.C. I'm Jenna Browder. Still, more than 8,000 men and women in uniform are on high alert, ready to move if needed. The world waiting for word on invasion or war in Eastern Europe. While Russian forces grow by the day, leaders repeatedly deny any plans to invade Ukraine. CBN's Brody Carter has our top story. Brody?
Jenna, the buildup of forces around Ukraine puts Russia in position to invade by land, air, and sea. And now NATO allies, including U.S. citizens on American soil, face very real threats of Russian cybersecurity attacks. Regardless, the White House says a Russian move is imminent.
We have no intention of putting American forces or NATO forces in Ukraine. As I said, there are going to be serious economic consequences if he moves.
More than 127,000 Russian soldiers currently surround the country. The Kremlin continues to dispute it has plans to invade, accusing the Biden administration of hysteria. World leaders point to the buildup of troops on the Ukraine border, including in Belarus, a country bordering 3 NATO allies, as enough evidence of an intent to invade.
We still don't believe that Mr. Putin has made a final decision, whether to conduct another incursion/invasion into Ukraine, so we still think there's time and space here.
President Biden met virtually with European leaders Monday, developing the NATO response force in efforts to deter further Russian aggression. That includes 8,500 U.S. troops now waiting on high alert for deployment to Eastern Europe. This, in addition to NATO allies who've already deployed military resources to the region, including warships, fighter jets, and military troops.
And if Vladimir Putin thinks that renewed aggression won't be met with severe, swift, united response, he would be wrong.
First established in 2014, the NATO Response Force is a result of Russia's original incursion into Ukraine. Notably absent from a unified show of force, Germany, the 3rd largest NATO member. The main reason is their reliance on Russia's natural gas pipeline, the newly built Nord Stream 2. Still, the White House maintains Germany will show up if Russia invades.
That unity doesn't happen on its own. It's required a lot of work. It also means that actions may not be identical, but we will be unified and they will be strong and severe.
Meanwhile, the U.S., UK, and Australia are evacuating families of its diplomats working in Kiev, with Israel preparing for a similar evacuation. An estimated 1,500 Americans still remain in Ukraine. In addition to the 8,500 troops on standby, other U.S. deterrents include $200 million in lethal assistance, which would buy things like ammunition and anti-tank missiles. Now, tomorrow, France and Germany, they're set to hold diplomatic talks in Paris with Ukraine and Russia. Jenna, back to you.
All right, Brody Carter, thank you. And here with us now, Michael O'Hanlon with the Brookings Institution. Michael, great to have you with us tonight. So the president says he assured the NATO allies that he has, that the U.S. has an obligation to come to their defenses, but he says no U.S. troops to Ukraine. Of course, Ukraine not a member of NATO. But would the U.S. be under any obligation to move U.S. and NATO troops into Ukraine in the event of a full-scale invasion?
Hi, Jenna. I think the short answer is no. Although there is a little bit of ambiguity because in 1994, shortly after the end of the Cold War and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Russia and the United States and a couple of European countries promised to uphold Ukraine's sovereignty. It wasn't a treaty, and obviously Russia's violated that promise long ago. But some people could say that was essentially a moral promise by the United States to help. But I don't think anybody interpreted that at the time to mean that we're going to go wage World War III inside of Ukraine when they're not even in NATO. So the short answer is no, there is no American obligation. And on that point, at least, I think President Biden's words have been correctly chosen.
Today, the president said he would personally sanction Vladimir Putin over possible invasion of Ukraine. What would that entail?
It's a great question. You know, we know certain things about where his money might be. I guess so far we've not directly tried to confiscate it or make it unavailable to him. I don't really know what else he means by that. I guess in theory you could somehow restrict Putin's ability to travel into Western countries. That would be a form of sanction. I'm not quite sure what President Biden is alluding to. I think he'd be better off talking about how we could develop a plan to wean Western Europe off of Russian energy and accelerate that transition as a response to any major aggression. I think that would be a more credible kind of threat. That's the one I would favor. But I assume he's talking about bank accounts, the existence of which we have some information about, but have so far allowed Putin to still access.
Yeah, to your point, Germany dragging its feet here in terms of making any kind of formal commitment. What do you think what do you think it'll take for Germany to step in here?
You know, Germany's always had this sort of sweet and sour, carrot and stick approach towards Russia. They felt that you have more influence if you maintain a positive dialogue. They're sort of in a long-standing state of détente, whereas we have oscillated between periods of détente and periods of toughness. It's going to be hard for Germany to keep doing business as usual if Russia really attacks Ukraine. And I think it would behoove German leadership to say that even if we're not going to get, they could articulate, the new chancellor, even if we're not going to get too specific about promises of sanctions or threats right now, there could be no business as usual with a Russia that had invaded Ukraine. I would welcome that kind of a comment. I don't think it has to be more specific than that. I don't think it has to, be more forward-leaning right now than that. But that would be a useful clarification.
So the White House was asked yesterday about the evacuation plans for families of diplomats in Ukraine, and if that had anything to do with the disastrous U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. Do you think Putin felt emboldened to encroach on Ukraine after seeing the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan?
Well, that's going to be a question we spend 2 and 3 and 4 years debating, Jenna, and I bet it comes back a lot in 2024. But I think the short answer is not too much, in the sense that usually if you look historically at how people evaluate their own local security environments, they don't worry so much about what the United States did 10,000 miles away, unless they really think they've got a green president who's just, really wavering and wobbly, and the person they don't know, and they're, only have so much information. They may overinterpret one case. With Biden, he's been around so long, and he has so many, traditional American foreign policy specialists in his team that I don't think that it's likely that Putin would say, well, I can attack Ukraine now because Biden wouldn't have responded. I don't think President Trump would have responded militarily either. I don't think President Bush would have responded militarily either. As you said at the beginning, Ukraine is not in NATO, and that's been a decision that American presidents have stood by, although President Bush did offer membership someday, but he couldn't persuade the rest of NATO to have a schedule as to when to do that. So we have a longstanding policy here of not promising military response for this kind of incursion.
All right, Michael, we're out of time, but it's always good to see you. Michael Hanlon with the Brookings Institution, thank you.
Thank you, Jenna.
Well, turning to inflation, consumers feeling the sting as prices keep going up. President Biden feeling the heat, too, lashing out at a reporter who asked him about inflation and the midterm elections. The New York Times editorial board out with this headline: the president's economy is failing the Big Mac test, meaning Americans can't buy as many hamburgers as they used to, a measure of how inflation is affecting the bottom line in household budgets. The Heritage Foundation's Joel Griffith on CBN's Faith Nation.
A lot of families, when they're going to the grocery store, if they can find the items they're looking for, they're finding, wow, we can't even afford to have a nice steak once a week. They're going ahead and buying ground chicken in substitute. And this is happening, though, in so many areas of consumers' lives.
Meanwhile, the president's critics say he isn't doing enough to fight inflation.
that Joe Biden knock-on-wood strategy is just not producing results. So what will they do for the next year is they will spin it, as we started to see yesterday, that it's not Joe Biden's fault, that it's the Republicans' fault, and you need to change your expectations because it's not really as bad as you really think it is.
A recent CBS News poll shows most Americans agree the president needs to do more. 65% say Biden isn't focusing enough on inflation, and 62% disapprove of his handling of the economy. Monday, the president showing frustration with a sarcastic and demeaning comment after a reporter asked him about inflation at a White House meeting on lowering prices.
Do you think inflation is a political liability?
That's a great asset. More inflation. What a stupid.
Biden later called the reporter to clear the air. The president contends that passing his stalled multi-trillion-dollar spending program will bring inflation down. And that New York Times editorial points to the administration's pandemic relief as one reason why it says things aren't worse. Not everyone agrees.
All of this government spending that we've seen over the past year and a half has actually made the situation worse. You know, so many families, they love getting those checks, for instance, in their checking accounts or in their mailboxes from the government about a year ago. Well, that's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to new spending.
And the Fed is expected to begin raising interest rates in March in an effort to bring down inflation. And with that, let's bring in Steve Skanke, a chief investment strategist at Keel Point. Steve, welcome. The Fed's meeting today and tomorrow. They're not expected to begin raising rates until March, but do you think they'll wait until then?
That's the expectation, Jenna. One of the things that the Fed has learned, and it was brought home very clearly and explicitly when its December meeting minutes came out on January 4, messaging is critical. Any decision to raise interest rates before March, when the taper finishes up, the end of the bond buying program is achieved, would be a big surprise to markets. That would cause a lot of frustration. So I think the Fed has learned that it can't have that sort of surprise, even if it thinks it needs to begin raising rates earlier. So I don't think we'll see anything before March when the bond buying program is finished.
Do you think the Fed will raise rates gradually by a quarter of a point at a time, or maybe go with something bigger like a half-point increase? And how many increases do you expect this year?
Well, I'm expecting, and I think the market generally is expecting, 4 rate increases of 0.25% at each raise. That's the easiest way to go. It gives the Fed time to reassess the impact of what it's done and hope that there can be some other amelioration of inflation along the way.
What impact do you think these rate increases could have on the economy? I mean, if we see rates, a whole point higher this time next year, that is significant.
Well, it'll slow the economy down a little bit. The challenge is that the consumer balance sheets are really in good order, and that's a good thing. And consumer spending is 70% of the economy, of the GDP. And we have a lot of demand for goods and services. Interestingly, when we look, though, at where the real inflation is coming from, core CPI was up 5.5% in December. Well, if you break that down, it's product prices were up 7%, services were up 2.7%. So it's this supply chain disruption which is the real culprit, and it's not clear that raising interest rates is going to make a very big impact on that. It just needs to work itself out.
All right. Steve Skanke with Keel Point, thank you so much. Have a great night.
Thank you.
And coming up, mask mandates on the chopping block. What that means for public schools and public locations in New York City. Welcome back. Tonight, a second NYPD officer has died after a deadly weekend in which 2 New York City police officers were shot. Now, after a wave of violence in his first 3 weeks in office, New York City Mayor Eric Adams is stepping up New York's efforts on gun control, doing more to seize illegal guns.
We will not surrender our city to the violent few.
And this string of recent violence could give Adams leverage to strengthen a police department that was fighting off calls to defund the police just a year and a half ago. Well, tonight, OSHA is withdrawing its workplace vaccine mandate. The reversal by the Biden administration over its vaccine or test requirement for large employers comes after a Supreme Court decision earlier this month. Meanwhile, a New York Supreme Court judge has struck down that state's mask mandate for all public schools and locations.
The Supreme Court has ruled that the mandates are unconstitutional.
The judge said the New York Department of Health didn't have the legal authority to implement the mandate. And when we come back, a CBN News exclusive. We sit down with the new Lieutenant Governor of Virginia. Her story and faith next. This month, Winsome Earl Sears made history when she became the first black woman to hold the office of Lieutenant Governor in Virginia. Earl Sears credits God with her long-shot victory as well as her education. Her top priority in office, helping children achieve success in the classroom. Heather Sells sat down with a Regent University graduate to talk about her vision for Virginia.
I, Winsome Earl Sears,
Do solemnly swear.
do solemnly swear
Winsome Sears overcame incredible odds to find herself at the seat of power on January 15th, being sworn in as the new Lieutenant Governor of Virginia and the first black woman elected to statewide office in the Commonwealth.
Born in Jamaica, Sears came to the U.S. as a young girl, following her father with the hope of finding a better life.
In a recent sit-down interview with CBN News, she described joining the Marines after the death of her beloved grandmother, looking for discipline and a reason to live. Another turning point came as a young mom, when she began turning to God.
I just never knew how to stay saved, as they say. You know, I kept falling away and coming back.
That all changed one Sunday morning as she cared for her young daughter at home, sensing she should go to church.
And I heard a voice say, she's going to grow up not knowing me, and she's going to blame you. That was the Lord. And I said, no, she's not. And right then and there, I looked for a church, and that's where I was discipled. And that's what started me in the path to me being the person I know now.
She would go on to lead a prison ministry, run a women's shelter, and get her master's degree in organizational leadership at Regent University. While there, she felt God calling her to run for office. While it was viewed as an impossible campaign against a well-funded longtime incumbent in the Virginia House of Delegates, she won.
I believe any time that you obey the Lord, you always win, no matter the outcome.
Sears has lived that belief. After one term as a state lawmaker, she felt called to run for Congress. After losing that race, Sears stepped away for 14 years until again feeling the call, this time as a write-in candidate for the U.S. Senate. She lost again, but didn't let that stop her.
Life comes at you hard, and there's always something in your life that's going to try and trip you up, and you just have to keep going.
And in 2021, the unlikely candidate, with her message of education first, won a historic victory. As a conservative black woman, Sears defeated 2 veteran lawmakers for the nomination and won the general election alongside gubernatorial candidate Glenn Youngkin. Their priority now, making school work for the Commonwealth's kids.
By the time the children in Virginia reach the 8th grade, fully 35% of Asian children cannot do math, 45% of white children, 70% of Latino children, 84% of black children cannot do math by the time they're in the 8th grade. And by the way, 85% of them functionally illiterate.
Sears says the answer is what she calls parental school choice, charter schools, and better pay for teachers. And she supports talking about race and racism in school.
There is a way to teach it such that the white child isn't made to be the oppressor, and the black child isn't made to feel as if they're victims.
In Sears' view, America's trajectory is on the rise. And along with the ugly, she wants children to learn the good.
We have a saying in church, and it's, I may not be what I'm supposed to be, but I ain't what I used to be. And that's America. She may not be what she's supposed to be, but she ain't what she used to be. She's not 1963, when my father first came, and I'm proof of that.
Sears also plans to focus on the economy, getting rid of Virginia's gas tax and providing a more welcoming environment for businesses to grow. And she's clear on COVID.
I think at some point, COVID is going to hit us all. And so we need to be prepared.
For Sears, that looks like consulting your doctor, getting the vaccine, and keeping an eye on personal liberty. In these times of polarization and divisiveness, she believes leadership can make the difference.
I think as the leader goes, so goes the country.
To that end, she's focused on bringing people together.
And depending on her success and Governor Youngkin's, many believe that 4 years from now, Sears could potentially become not only Virginia's first black female governor, but the first in the history of the United States. Heather Sells, CBN News.
All right, thank you, Heather. Great interview. And you can see our CBN News special presentation, a conversation with Winsome Sears, by going to cbnnews.com. All right, still ahead, it's a boy. Meet the newest addition to the CBN News family. And finally tonight, the Faith Nation team is excited to announce the newest addition to the CBN News family. Over the weekend, our CBN News Capitol Hill correspondent Abigail Robertson and her husband Derek welcomed a baby boy into the world. Meet Daniel Robertson. Both baby and mom are happy and healthy and glad to be home, we can report. Where Daniel's big sister, Annalisa Joy, was eagerly waiting to meet him. Of course, a big congratulations to the family and welcome to the world, Daniel. He is precious. Oh, what a gift. Well, that is going to do it for Faith Nation tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a great Tuesday night, and we'll see you right back here again tomorrow. Take care.